My name is Brady, and I'm a follower of Jesus. And this is, if you're new to LifePoint, that's what we want to be, is followers of Jesus. We just want to strive to follow Jesus the best that we can. We want to continually reorient our lives around being with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, and partnering with him on his mission. And so we've been in the book of Matthew because of that. The book of Matthew is the first of the Gospels that recounts the life of Jesus. And if you're anything like me, you've been amazed by this book and the depth that the Spirit of God wrote through Matthew. It's been incredible. We spent a ton of time in the Sermon on the Mount. And so we got to hear Jesus' teachings. We got to sit at his feet up on the mountain as he delivered the greatest message ever given. I know it's hard to believe when you've heard me give messages, but it really was the greatest message ever given. Don't laugh, that's rude. That's rude. But he's teaching, and he talks about this upside-down kingdom, right? This kingdom that's completely countercultural, that's different from the way that we live, the way that we interact. This kingdom that's about love and about serving. This kingdom that's about going out and reaching out to people rather than being all about ourselves. And then Jesus comes down the mountain, and he does some very significant things. Let's pick up Matthew chapter 8, verse 14. And it says this: "And when Jesus entered Peter's house," that would be Simon Peter, his disciple, "when he entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick with a fever. And he touched her hand, and the fever left her. And she rose and began to serve him. And that evening, they brought to him many who were oppressed by demons. And he cast out the spirits with a word, and he healed all who were sick. And this was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases." Now, if you were with us about 3 weeks ago, we talked about the second half of this. We talked about Jesus taking on our illnesses and our burdens and our weaknesses. And it's so neat to see the way that Jesus views mission. Basically, his version of mission is, where am I? What do I see? What doesn't belong in the kingdom of heaven? Let me go out and change that. So he sees a leper, and he says, well, leprosy, that doesn't belong in the kingdom of heaven. And so he changes it. He heals him. He reaches out, he stretches his hand out as far as he can go. And then he comes across, who does he come across next? You guys remember? A centurion, a Gentile. He sees this Gentile, and this guy comes up and says, "My servant is sick. Will you heal him?" And he heals him. And then today, he comes into contact with Peter's mother-in-law. Now, this is really important that we view these three stories together. And the reason that we know to do this is because this verse begins with the ever-important word "and." It's important. Like, you probably never thought the word "and" was important, but it's so important. Does anybody know what kind of word "and" is? Yes, conjunction, junction. What's your function? It's got to join phrases and clauses and stuff. Like, that's what it's supposed to do. It joins things together. So when we see "and," it lets us know, hey, this is not by itself. And when you see this story by itself, it's good. It really is. It's beautiful. It's nice. But when you see it in conjunction with the other two stories that it was written to be with, it has a whole new level, a whole new layer of beauty with it. So, right, we start with Jesus healing the leper, and then Jesus healing the centurion servant, and then here, him healing Peter's mother-in-law. And the thing that we begin to have to wrestle with is this idea of God's holiness. If you were with us a few weeks ago, we looked at this video from the Bible Project, and it talked about God's holiness. The word holy means set apart, unique, that God is set apart from all other creation, from all other being, in the way that he is the creator and he is the sustainer of the universe, right? He spoke the world into existence, and he holds it together by the power of his word. He is the creator and the sustainer, but he's also set apart in his moral purity and his moral perfection. God is utterly perfect. There is no shadow in God. There is no twist in God. He is completely and utterly perfect. Now, the Bible Project used the sun as an analogy. It talked about how the sun, right? The sun is holy, and things around the sun are holy in differing degrees. And the sun, by its nature, consumes what is flammable. So if there's anything that's flammable in the least extent, as it gets close to the sun, it will be burned up. In the same way, God's holiness burns up what is evil. which we don't want anything evil to exist, right? We don't want evil to exist. So it's good that the closer you get to God, the more that things that are evil get burned up. But that's kind of dangerous when you're evil. And if you're here and you're breathing, you're evil, okay? And we all have evil in us. We all have rebelled. We've all sinned. We've all failed. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. Every single one of us, right? It's just part of our humanity. We were born into sin. And so that gets dangerous, right? So God decides he's going to dwell amongst a people called Israel. Would you think, yay, that's good. We were created to need intimacy with God. Like we need closeness to God, but oh, yikes, you're holy, I'm not. What's going to happen? Am I going to get burned up? How is this going to work? And you see the picture with Moses when he comes into contact with the burning bush and God says, don't come any closer. Take off your sandals. You're on holy ground. And so what God did was he gave Israel the tabernacle. We have a picture of the tabernacle. Will you show it to us? Yeah. So this is the tabernacle. In the book of Leviticus, God said, I'm going to dwell with you, but it's going to be in a certain way. And we're going to have the tabernacle. And here's what it is this big tent and this outer curtain. This outer curtain like denotes the level of this inner court. And then in that tent, there are two different sections to that tent. One is the holy place, and then separated by this veil, this curtain that's about 4 inches thick, is the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. And that was where God allowed his glory, his presence to dwell. Now, the people of Israel, having the tabernacle and God's holiness in their presence, had to be clean. A couple weeks ago, we talked about this, the idea of ritually clean or unclean. And if you were clean, you could be in the temple and you could worship God. But if you were unclean, you couldn't. And we talked about how the leper was unclean. Now, here's the way that this works. There were kind of these levels, okay? Kind of like the closer you get to the sun, the hotter it is. The closer you get to God, kind of the hotter his glory or his holiness burns. And so, if you were an Israelite, so if you were a part of God's chosen people, if you were an Israelite and you were clean, you were ritually clean, you hadn't come into contact with anything that was unclean, and if you had, you had done the ritual things that you needed to do and waited the time period that you needed to wait, but if you were clean and you were an Israelite, you could enter into this intercourt inside the white curtains, okay? You could be in there and you could worship God. Now, that was totally okay. But you couldn't go into that closed-off tent area unless you were a priest. Now, a priest was a part of the tribe of Levi. Okay, you had these priests, and they were a select group of people from the tribe of Levi. If you were a priest, you had to go through another level of cleansing. You had to go through another, set of rules and regulations to make yourself even more clean, because you could then go into the holy place. Okay, this was a big deal. They could go into the holy place, but only once a year, only one person from the entire nation of Israel could go into the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place, and that was the high priest. And the high priest had special garments. He had these special rituals he had to go through. He had these rituals he had to go through just to even go into the most holy place. And so you begin to see the way that holiness works, is that we are so far from God's holiness. And it's a long journey into that holiness. And so God set it up where he would dwell in the most holy place. The Holy of Holies was there, and the priest could enter into that. And then Israel, if they were clean, could enter into that inner court. Well, things changed a lot. What happened was, first of all, Israel went into the land. They went into the promised land, and they no longer needed a portable tabernacle. So they built a temple. That temple was destroyed. They rebuilt the temple, and then Herod, the one who was, Herod the Great, the one who was around when Jesus was born, he was the king over Israel at that point in time, he made this magnificent temple. And so we have a picture of that. And here's what that temple looked like. So it's beautiful. I mean, it's magnificent. It's amazing. I can't imagine how long it took or how expensive it was. But that's the temple. And what you have in this temple, which is in the city of Jerusalem, you have all these different courts that were added. So show us the aerial view. This is the aerial view, kind of. Okay, it's not like a real aerial view. It's not like Google Maps over there. But what we have is you have that big, large court that you saw. That was the court of Gentiles. That's as far in as Gentiles could go. And then if you were an Israelite, you could pass through the beautiful gate. Oh yeah, I forgot. I got a laser pointer. You could pass through the beautiful gate, which is right here, right? If you were Israelite and you were clean, you could pass through the beautiful gate and you could come into this, the section of this inner court. But you had right here the court of women. And what they had done is they had segregated the women from the men, and the women could only come this far. They could not go through the gate of Nicanor, right? This is something that was not a part of the tabernacle. This was not a part of the way that God designed it to be, but it was a part of the way that in Herod's time they did it. So women, Jewish women could come into here if they were clean. And then if you were a Jewish male and you were clean, you could go through the gate of Nicanor and you could be in this inner court of Israel. Right? And then if you were a priest, you'd go into the holy place. And if you were the high priest, once a year, you could go into the most holy place. So that's the way that it was in Jesus' time for people to enter into God's presence and to worship him. And you see all these divisions, all these methods of segregation. And when you look at what Jesus does, okay, Jesus is up on the mountain. He's giving the law of God, and he's giving it as God himself, right? He doesn't say, hey, the law says this, and here's how you should interpret it. He says, here's what the law says, but I say this. He put himself on the level with the law that was given by God. And so Jesus is up on the mountain like Moses, but actually giving the law like God, and he comes down the mountain, and he interacts with 3 different people. The first one is the leper. And the leper was the most unclean you could be. So if you look at the temple, right, and you're looking at these different courts, the leper, he couldn't even be in the court of Gentiles. In fact, he couldn't even be in the entire city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was walled off, and lepers had to be outside the walls of cities. So that's where the leper was. That's how far he had to be away from the presence of God. And then you have a centurion who is a Gentile. And so the farthest he could come would have been to this court of the Gentiles. And then the next person that Jesus interacts with is a woman. He reaches out and he touches Peter's mother-in-law. She could only come to the court of women. And you see Matthew showing so clearly what Jesus has done, saying, hey, I came to the most excluded, to the most oppressed, to the most overlooked, to the people that are on the outskirts. And I want to show you, not just tell you with my voice, not just tell you about the kingdom of heaven, but I want to demonstrate for you who I am here for. And I love the way that it displays the character of God, that Jesus goes out. It's not like they have to come in. Jesus goes out to the leper. He goes out to the Gentile, and he goes out to Peter's mother-in-law, to the woman. And you see Jesus inviting them into his presence, saying, you can come into the presence of God. There is no limits between you and me. As he stretches his hand out to the leper, as he stretches his hand out to Peter's mother-in-law. And I love the difference in this. So the leper comes up to Jesus and is like, hey, you can heal me. And then the centurion comes up to Jesus and says, you can heal my servant. And Peter's mother-in-law, she didn't say anything. Now, I don't know if this works, for you in your, marriage and your family, but when I'm sick, I'm the worst. I'm like, oh, help me, get me stuff. Oh, can you give me some more water? Can you give me some medicine? Jen, she hates it when I'm sick because I'm the worst patient ever. And Jen, when she's sick, she's like up, going to work, getting stuff done, taking care of me. Right? Isn't that like women? Like just so strong. Peter's mother-in-law doesn't say anything. She didn't say, I'm sick, Master, can you heal me? No. What happens is Jesus is looking around and he sees her. He sees her and he sees that she's sick and he goes to her without any request. And he puts his hand on her and he heals her. And then she begins to serve him. It's beautiful. What Jesus does here is just the tip of the iceberg of what he does throughout the rest of his entire ministry. Jesus, throughout his ministry, continues to elevate women to the status of equality. It's really beautiful what he does. Because women in that day and age, they were second-class citizens. They were considered second-class citizens. They weren't allowed to vote. Women were only educated up to the age of 12. They only got to go to the very first section of Jewish schooling, right? Bet Sefer. They couldn't go out to Bet Midrash, and they definitely couldn't be Bet Talmud. They couldn't become a disciple of a rabbi. They were not allowed to be the disciple of a rabbi. The husband in many parts of Rome had the power of life and death over his wife. So if he didn't like his wife, he could sentence her to death. He was in charge of the kids. In fact, if they were divorced, the wife didn't have the authority over the kids. The husband did. And if the husband was dead, then the closest living male relative had authority over the kids, not the wife, not the mom. They weren't trusted as witnesses in a court of law. In a court of law, they couldn't be deposed as a witness, even if they saw what happened, because they weren't trusted. They didn't think women were trustworthy. And you see this play out pretty well in John chapter 8. In John chapter 8, Jesus is hanging out in town, and these leaders of the city bring this woman before Jesus. And they say, Jesus, this woman was caught in the act of adultery, and the law says we should stone her to death. What should you do? What do you say? And I think the first thing that we should see is, maybe I don't understand it real well, but I think adultery takes two people, right? Is that fair? It takes two. Where's the man? Right? They drag the woman before Jesus to stone her to death, and they don't do anything with the man. Like, that is the way it worked out in that society in his day and age. The way that they viewed women versus the way that they viewed men. The way that men got away with things and women didn't. The way that they were oppressed, the way they were excluded, the way they were looked down upon, the way they couldn't come in to the court with the men. And Jesus, in his ministry, he reaches out to women. Like in this way that was radical for his day and age. And we see it throughout his ministry. In Luke chapter 7, there's this instance where he's hanging out, he's been invited to this important person's house to have dinner, Simon. Simon's a Pharisee, and he's an important religious person. And Jesus goes and he eats at his house, and then this woman who's a sinful woman, she comes and she begins to go right by Jesus, and she starts just weeping. And she wets Jesus' feet with her tears, and then she takes her hair and she dries off and cleans and wipes down his feet with her hair. And Simon, the religious leader, the Pharisee, he thinks to himself, Jesus must not be a prophet. If he knew this woman, if he knew what kind of woman she was, he wouldn't allow her to touch him. And what Jesus does in this instance is beautiful. He says to Simon, do you see this woman? Which I think is such a shocking question, because at that dinner party, there's only one thing that everybody saw, and it was the woman. She was making a spectacle of herself. She's weeping enough that she can wash his feet with her tears, right? It's not just like one little tear. It's not like her eyes got watery. Like, she is ugly crying. You know what I'm talking about? Just so many tears that she's able to wash his feet with her tears. Everybody saw the woman. And yet Jesus says, do you see her? Because although his eyes saw her, he didn't see her. He didn't really see her. And what Jesus does for this woman is he makes her visible. She was invisible, and he makes her visible. He declares worth and value over her as he says, she is the example, Simon, of what it looks like to love much. She knows where she's been. She knows that she's been forgiven much, and you don't. That's what it looks like to love much. And then in John chapter 4, Jesus and his disciples, they go through Samaria. And this is just an area north of Jerusalem where half Gentile, half Jewish people live. And he goes to this well, and his disciples go into town, and he's sitting at the well, and this woman who's a Samaritan comes out, and he begins to have a conversation with her. And she's so shocked that they're having a conversation. She says, don't you understand that I'm a woman and a Gentile? And you're a Jewish man? We shouldn't be interacting, right? Well, what's going on here? And it's really beautiful. If you read through this story, it's really beautiful because Jesus invites her into a theological discussion. And he doesn't look down upon her. He doesn't look down upon her opinions that are wrong about theology. He respects her, and he offers her this beautiful respect as they have this discussion about theology. And he offers her this living water. It's beautiful. And then in Luke chapter 10, He's with Mary and Martha. We've talked about Mary and Martha a few times, and we focus on Martha a lot. But a lot of times we miss what happens with Mary. It says that Mary was sitting at Jesus' feet. Now, the reason that is so significant is because that is a phrase that was common that meant a disciple. So you could say someone was someone's disciple, or you could say that person sits at the rabbi's feet. Okay? So when we read, she was sitting at his feet, we are supposed to read into it that she was a disciple. Women weren't supposed to be disciples of rabbis. And Jesus allows her to be a disciple along with the men. This was huge. This was revolutionary. And not only does he allow it, he promotes it. He tells Martha, Mary has chosen the good portion, and it's not going to be taken from her. I'm not going to take this away from her. This is the good portion, that she would be a disciple. Later on in his ministry, in Matthew 26, Mary, same Mary that was sitting at his feet, she anoints him with these expensive, perfumes. And the disciples freak out. They're like, this money could be used for other things. Why did she waste all this on you? And Jesus said, here's the deal. She's just anointed me for my burial. And wherever the gospel is proclaimed, this story is going to be told about her. Like, he totally honors her, gives her dignity and worth and value. After Jesus raises from the grave, do you know who the first witnesses of the resurrection were? Women. Which is such good news, because it's one of the reasons that I believe the Bible to be authentic. Because if you were trying to make up a story in the first century, you wouldn't have women be your first witnesses. Why? They weren't trusted as witnesses. Women were not trusted witnesses. And not only did Jesus, in his sovereignty allow women to be the very first witnesses to his resurrection, he sovereignly chose for it to be written in all the Gospels. He wanted it displayed. He wanted to give them prominence as the first witnesses to his resurrection. Do you know who was the very first person sent to proclaim the good news that Jesus has risen from the grave? Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene was sent to go proclaim to the disciples who were afraid and hiding behind locked doors that Jesus has risen from the grave. Right? He doesn't just give her prominence, he gives her a voice, and he gives her something significant to say. You see the way Jesus treats women, it's brilliant. In Luke chapter 8, we find out that Jesus' ministry is funded by women. That's how Jesus was able to travel around with his disciples and not work, because wealthy women funded his ministry. And what you see throughout Jesus' time on earth, he continues to lift up this group of people that has been excluded, that has been looked down upon, that has been oppressed, that has been invisible, that's been overlooked. And he gives them honor, respect, dignity, worth, value. He makes them visible. It's beautiful what Jesus does. And it's something that we still need to hear today. And I know that we've made strides since the first century, but we've got a long way to go. I was reading this study yesterday from the New York Times. It was done by this Virginia University, or the University of Virginia. And what they did is they looked into car accidents. And what they found is that female drivers are 47% more likely to get injured in an accident than male drivers, because safety standards for cars are designed with men in mind. 47% more likely to get injured than men. Do you know that every single day, 33,000 girls under the age of 18 are married off? 33,000 girls every day are married off who are under the age of 18. And many of them are forced into this. That's 1 every 3 seconds. The World Economic Forum studied all the data and said, at our current rate, it would take 108 years for us to reach equality between men and women. 108 years. 1 in 3 women have no say over major purchases for the household. 1 in 3 women worldwide have no say over major household purchases. in the film industry, which is important to know because the film industry shapes our worldview. What we see on TV and what we see in the movies shapes the way that we think, shapes the way that we understand the world. There's one female to every 4 male producers. There's one female to every 5 male writers. And there's one female to every 14 female directors. And that shapes the stories that we read, and that shapes the stories that we watch. It shapes the characters that we see. And that stuff, that's just the small stuff. 1 in 3 women have experienced physical or sexual violence. 1 in 3 women have experienced physical or sexual violence. 4.8 million women in America every year experience some sort of abuse from their spouse. And less than 20% seek medical help, mainly out of fear. Women are twice as likely to be the victim of a homicide by a spouse or a family member. There are 40 million slaves currently today, and 71% are women. Sex trafficking is a $150 billion a year industry, and most of the people affected are women. And do you know the number one consumer is the United States? The United States is the number one consumer of sex trafficking. Number one. We are funding that industry, $150 billion a year industry. And particularly this weekend, which is a high-profile weekend for sex trafficking, the Super Bowl. I think it's important for us to take stock of what is going on in our culture, in our society, in our world. And do we live with the same heart, with the same mind, with the same care as Jesus did for the people that are excluded, for the people that are oppressed, for the people that are overlooked, for the people that are looked down upon? It didn't start with the Gospels. You know, it starts back in Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis chapter 1, God is creating this beautiful world. And he has this conversation about how he wants to create humanity. And he says this, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over the livestock, and over all the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And what we see in Genesis chapter 1 is that both men and women are created as image bearers of God. Both are God image bearers. And secondly, humanity, men and women, were created to rule together. Together they were called to have dominion. Let them have dominion. They were called to rule together. Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, it says this. Then the Lord God said, it's not good that the man should be alone. I will make a helper fit for him. Now this word helper fit, this is the Hebrew word ezer kenegdo, or it's the 2 words. And what ezer kenegdo means is this, an opposite facing equal to rescue or help one do what one cannot do on one's own. Kenegdo means opposite facing equal, right? Eve was taken from Adam's side, not from his feet and not from his head, right? Equal. Men and women were created utterly equal. And the word ezer, that we translate helper, of the 21 times that it's used in Scripture, 16 of those times is used to refer to God. And it means helper, but it also means rescuer. It means redeemer. It means savior. We see it in Psalm 33:20. Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our ezer and our shield, right? That's a war term, right? He's going to defend us. Psalm 75 says, but I am poor and needy. Hasten to me, O God. You are my ezer and my deliverer. God is the one who delivers us, and it's the word ezer is there. So this word helper fit, this is this beautifully magnificent word given to the woman that she shares with God. And there's nothing lesser about women when they were created. Nothing at all. Women are just as valuable as men, created to rule together. Paul talks about this in Ephesians. He talks about how we're supposed to relate to one another in community. And he says this, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 18 says this, be filled with the Spirit. And then he gives a list of some things that we're supposed to do that entail being filled with the Spirit. And one of those, in verse 21, is this, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. So the way that we're called to interact with one another, all of us in the kingdom of heaven, in the churches, we're called to submit to one another. And that word submit is to put yourself under them, to subject yourself under each other. So we're all called to submit to each other together. And then Paul gives these examples about how it works with husbands and wives, and then how it works with children and parents, and then how it works with slaves and masters. And with husbands and wives, he begins here with probably the verse that is taken most out of context, Ephesians 5:22, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. Now, if you're not a wives, raise your hand. Okay. Don't read this verse. It's not to you. Okay. Do you hear me? If you're not a wives, this is not for you. See, so often what we want to do is we want to take scripture that's for other people. Because I love finding scripture that other people need to hear, don't you? You hear a good message, you're like, oh, my wife needs to hear this. Oh, my husband needs to hear this. Oh, my kids need to hear this. Oh, my best friend that I'm going to fight with really needs to hear this so they'll stop being an idiot. And don't we do that? We need to start with the verses that are addressed to us, okay? And if you can get the ones that are addressed to you, then maybe move on to the ones that are addressed to others. But this is difficult, okay? So to wives, Paul says, submit yourself to your husbands. Now, we know this is in the context of everybody submitting to one another. Do you know how we know that? Because in verse 22, the word submit is not there. It's not there at all. There's no verb in that sentence. Now, the way that you do Greek, that's fine, right? It's fine that you do that. You would borrow the verb, the closest verb that was before it, which is submitting. So just like everyone's called to submit to each other, wives are called to submit to their husbands, right? Definitely. In subjection, in respect, for sure. That is a good and beautiful way. But in our day and age, that just rings like bells. Like this word submission is like the worst, it's like the longest 4-letter word ever, right? It's just, we don't want to submit to anybody. This is a huge deal. This sentence, when people were reading this Ephesus, would have been the biggest no-duh ever. Because you were required by law to submit to your husband. It was in the law. You had to. They'd have been like, Paul, why are you wasting ink? Yes, obviously we need to submit to our husbands. That's the way that it is. I know, it's really bad. It's awful. But get what follows up next. Okay, here we go. Husbands. Okay. If you're not a husband, stop listening. You probably weren't listening to me anyway. That's fine. Husbands, love your wives. This is huge. Husbands they didn't have to love their wives. But Paul says in the family of God, husbands are commanded to love their wives. And not just any kind of love, not like you love ice cream. Love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. How did Jesus give himself up for the church? He died on the cross. Paul says, this is the specific way I want you to love your wives. As Jesus died to himself, like literally on the cross, I want you to die for your wife. I want you to die to your desires, your wants, your needs, your rights for the good of your wife. He uses the Greek word agape. And here's what this word means. It basically means self-sacrificial, giving of oneself to serve the greater good of the other. Agape means self-sacrificial, giving of oneself to serve the greater good of the other. And you see this most beautifully in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus, the night before he's crucified, he's praying, he's pleading with the Father. He's so stressed out about what's about to happen, about his suffering and his death and taking on sin, that he's sweating drops of blood. And he cries out to God the Father and says, I don't want to do this. I don't want to have to go through this. My desires, my human will, my human longings is that I don't want this. But then he says, but not what I want. Not what I will, but what you want. So husbands, what we are called to do is say, not what I want, but what you want. See, the way that we typically make this work out in society and in marriage, it's all about power. It's about who's in charge. It's about who gets to have the final say. It's about who gets to make the decisions. And Paul says, here's the deal. I want you to think of marriage as a competition. Who's competitive in here? I'm competitive. Okay. Lynn better be raising his hand wherever he is, right? Paul says, I want it to be a competition. But it's not a competition to see who's on top. It's a race to the bottom. It's a competition to see who can bow the furthest. That's what marriage is supposed to be. That it's each person trying to bow farther than the other person, trying to serve greater than the other person, trying to bestow more honor and more respect on the other person than they have themselves. And when both people are doing that, it works out really well. I should wake up every single morning and I should think to myself, how can I die to what I want, what I desire, to serve the greater good of my wife? That's what I should wake up thinking. I don't, but I should. But I can tell you, I can guarantee it, every time my wife and I sought each other and approached each other in agape, it always went well. Always. And every time one or both of us didn't, it didn't go well. When both people are dying to themselves to serve the greater good of the other, it works out well. When both people are doing what Jesus did, walking in Jesus' footsteps, as Paul talks about in Philippians chapter 2, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourself. And the way that we're called to treat one another, and the way that Jesus demonstrates with women in particular in this passage, we are called to treat women as better than ourselves. What Jesus does here is magnificent. He comes down the mountain and enters into people's lives, and we see him stretching out his hand as far as he can go to touch the leper, the most excluded in Israeli society, in Jewish society. And then he reaches out to the centurion, the Gentile who was unclean, and he heals his servant with a word. And then, without being asked, he sees Peter's mother-in-law sick, and he reaches out and he touches her and he heals her. And he calls us to follow in those exact same footsteps. And here's what I love about Jesus. It doesn't stop there. He doesn't simply talk about it on the Sermon on the Mount. And he doesn't simply go down and physically care for people and touch people and heal people. He goes even further. And in Matthew chapter 27, verse 50, it says this, and Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. This is him on the cross dying. It says he yielded up his spirit. He died. And here's what happened. And behold, the curtain of the temple. This is the curtain, the 4-inch thick curtain that separated the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, from the holy place. And the curtain of the temple was torn into from top to bottom. In Jesus giving up his life, suffering on our behalf, he said, I'm making a way for everybody to enter into the presence of God. It doesn't matter if you are a Jew or a Gentile. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. You are welcome into the presence of God because of my death and my resurrection. That's what Jesus did on the cross, and that's what he did on Easter Sunday when he rose from the grave. That all of us are considered equally loved, equally valued, equally worthy of being died for, and equally worthy of being invited into the family of God.